The morning sun had barely risen over the Miami skyline when the courthouse doors opened, letting in the first wave of people seeking justice, mercy, or sometimes just a chance to be heard. Among them was a small figure, barely visible behind her grandmother's protective frame. This was little Rose Thompson, just 8 years old, clutching her grandmother's hand as they made their way through the imposing security checkpoints. The courthouse itself was a maze of marble floors and echoing hallways, intimidating even to adults, let alone a child who should have been sitting in her third-grade classroom that morning. But Rose wasn't in school. Instead, she was here, in the juvenile court division, her small feet dragging slightly as she walked, her usually bright eyes dulled by hunger and worry. Mrs. Thompson, Rose's grandmother, had been up since 4 a.m., having worked a night shift at the local hospital as a cleaning staff member. She hadn't had time to prepare breakfast, not that there was much to prepare anyway. The last few dollars in her purse were saved for bus fare to get them both back home after the court hearing. The cabinet at home held only a few packets of instant noodles, meant to last until her next paycheck arrived in 3 days. As they sat on the hard wooden benches outside courtroom C, Rose's stomach let out a loud growl. She tried to silence it by pressing her hands against her belly, a move she perfected over the past few months. Her grandmother noticed and reached into her worn purse, hoping to find a forgotten mint or piece of gum, but found nothing. The pain in her heart was worse than any physical hunger she'd ever felt. Around them, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Lawyers in expensive suits rushed past, their leather briefcases swinging. Court officers directed traffic, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. A cleaning lady mopped the floors, working around the feet of waiting families. Rose watched it all with quiet curiosity, her eyes following each person, perhaps wondering if any of them felt as hungry as she did. The air conditioning in the building was running full blast, making Rose wish she had a sweater. Her grandmother had tried to make her look her best for court. Her hair was neatly braided, her school uniform pressed despite being slightly too small, and her face scrubbed clean. But there was no hiding the tiredness in her young eyes, or the way her uniform hung a bit looser than it should on her small frame. Time seemed to move differently in the courthouse. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for their case to be called. Rose watched as other families went in and out of the courtroom, some leaving with tears, others with relief on their faces. She wondered what would happen to her. Would the judge be angry that she missed so many days of school? Would anyone understand that sometimes the walk to school felt impossible when her stomach was so empty she got dizzy? Her grandmother had tried explaining why they were here, something about truancy and mandatory attendance, but Rose's mind kept drifting to the smell of breakfast coming from the cafe across the street. The scent of coffee and fresh bread wafted through the courthouse windows, making her stomach growl even louder. A kind-faced secretary walking past gave her a sympathetic look, perhaps recognizing the sound all too well. The morning dragged on, and the courthouse grew more crowded. People shuffled in and out, the sound of footsteps, whispered conversations, and occasional sobs creating a strange symphony of justice in motion. Rose noticed how some people looked as tired as she felt, while others seemed angry or scared. She held tighter to her grandmother's hand, drawing comfort from the familiar touch. Finally, their turn approached. Rose could hear the court officer calling cases, his voice getting closer to their number. Her grandmother straightened her dress and whispered words of encouragement, though her own voice trembled slightly. They had been dreading this day, but there was no avoiding it anymore. The truancy notices had piled up, and the school's patience had run out. As they waited for their case to be called, Rose thought about her classroom, her teacher, and her friends. She loved school, really she did. She loved learning about numbers and letters, hearing stories during reading time, and playing with her classmates during recess. But lately, everything had become so much harder. The walk to school seemed longer, the days felt endless, and concentrating on an empty stomach was almost impossible. Just then, the court officer's voice rang out, calling their case number. Rose's grandmother stood, gently pulling Rose to her feet. As they walked toward the courtroom doors, Rose's small shoes made soft tapping sounds against the marble floor, joining the symphony of courthouse sounds. She didn't know it yet, but she was about to meet a judge who would change not just her life, but the lives of many children who would come after her. They'd paused at the heavy wooden doors, and for a moment, Rose looked up at the high ceiling, the morning sun streaming through tall windows creating patterns on the floor. Whatever happened next would shape her future, but right now, all she could think about was the gnawing emptiness in her stomach and the hope that someone would understand. The courtroom felt impossibly large to Rose as she stepped inside. Everything seemed to tower above her, the high ceiling with its rows of bright lights, the massive wooden panels covering the walls, and especially the judge's bench, which rose like a mountain before her. The sound of her footsteps changed from the sharp clicks of the marble hallway to muffled thuds on the thick carpet. People filled the benches behind them, their whispers creating a soft hum in the air. Rose could feel their eyes on her back as she walked forward with her grandmother. The court officer directed them to stand behind a large wooden table, his face stern but his eyes kind when they met Rose's nervous gaze. Judge Wilson sat above them all, his silver hair and black robe making him look like someone from another world. He was reviewing papers on his desk, occasionally adjusting his reading glasses as he flipped through the pages. Rose noticed how his forehead wrinkled when he read, reminding her of how her grandmother's face looked when she was worried about bills. Case number 247, the court clerk announced, her voice clear and official. Regarding the matter of Rose Thompson truancy violation. The judge looked up from his papers, his eyes finding Rose. She tried to stand straight and tall, just as her grandmother had taught her, but she felt so small under his gaze. Her empty stomach chose that moment to let out another loud growl, the sound seeming to echo in the quiet courtroom. A few people chuckled softly, but quickly fell silent when the judge cleared his throat. "Young lady," he said, his voice deep but not unkind, "can you tell me why you're here today?" Rose opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked up at her grandmother, who squeezed her hand gently, encouraging her to answer. The judge waited patiently, his hands folded on the desk above. Finally, Rose found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I missed school, sir." "And why did you miss school?" the judge asked, leaning forward slightly. "Your teachers say you're a bright student when you're there." Rose's vision blurred slightly as tears threatened to fall. She blinked them back, remembering her grandmother's words about being brave. But standing there, with her stomach feeling like it was trying to eat itself, all she could think about was the breakfast she hadn't had, or the dinner she'd missed the night before, or how sometimes during class the letters on the board would swim before her eyes because she was so hungry she couldn't focus. She started, then stopped. The truth felt too big, too hard to explain. How could she tell this important man in his big black robe that sometimes the walk to school felt like climbing a mountain? How could she explain that sitting in class was like trying to learn through fog when her stomach was so empty it hurt? The judge was still waiting, his expression patient but expectant. Rose could feel her grandmother's hand trembling slightly in hers. She knew her grandmother worked so hard, knew how much it hurt her that she couldn't always put food on the table. She didn't want to say anything that would make people think badly of the woman who had taken her and when no one else could. But the hunger was too real, too present to ignore. It sat like a rock in her empty stomach, making her feel dizzy and weak. The fluorescent lights of the courtroom seemed too bright, and the room felt like it was spinning slightly. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," she finally said, her voice breaking slightly. I can't think straight right now. She paused, gathering all her courage. "I'm just so hungry." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The soft murmur of the courtroom went completely silent. Rose could hear her own heart beating in her ears. She hadn't meant to say it, hadn't meant to let everyone know. But there it was, the truth she'd been trying to hide behind her pressed uniform and neatly braided hair. She felt her grandmother stiffen beside her, heard the sharp intake of breath. Rose wanted to take the words back, to stuff them back inside where they belonged with all the other truths they tried to keep hidden. But she couldn't. They were out now, floating in the air of the courtroom for everyone to hear. The judge's expression changed, something flickering across his face too quickly for Rose to understand. He looked at her differently now, not just as another case number or troubled student, but as what she really was, a hungry child trying her best to survive in a world that sometimes felt too hard. The court clerk shuffled some papers, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. Someone coughed in the back of the room. Rose stood there, feeling exposed and vulnerable, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake by telling the truth. But then something extraordinary happened. The judge removed his reading glasses slowly, deliberately, and set them down on his desk. His eyes, when they met Rose's again, had changed. The official sternness had melted away, replaced by something else, something that looked a lot like understanding. No one in that courtroom, not even Rose herself, could have predicted what would happen next. But in that moment, as judge and child looked at each other across the vast expanse of the courtroom, something shifted. The truth, spoken from the heart of a hungry child, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change not just one life, but an entire community. Something extraordinary happened in that courtroom after Rose's honest words hung in the air. Judge Wilson sat perfectly still for a moment, his hands folded on the bench before him. Then, without any warning, he did something that made everyone in the courtroom freeze in surprise. He stood up. "This court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice firm but gentler than before. The sound of his gavel echoed through the stunned silence. Nobody moved at first, as if they couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. The judge was already removing his black robe, carefully hanging it on the hook behind his chair. The court clerk blinked in confusion, her pen hovering over the day's records. The bailiff shifted uncertainly on his feet, watching as Judge Wilson stepped down from the bench. This wasn't normal procedure. Everyone knew that. Judges didn't just step down in the middle of proceedings, especially not because a child said she was hungry. But Judge Wilson wasn't thinking about normal procedures right now. He was thinking about the look in Rose's eyes, the kind of hunger that went deeper than just missing breakfast. He was thinking about his own childhood, about the times when his mother had gone without dinner so he could eat, about the shame and the struggle that no child should have to carry. He walked across the courtroom, his polished shoes making soft sounds on the carpet. As he approached Rose and her grandmother, people in the gallery started whispering. Some were reaching for their phones, but the bailiff quickly reminded them that recording wasn't allowed in the courtroom. "Mrs. Thompson," the judge said, addressing Rose's grandmother directly. His voice was different now, not the official tone of a judge, but the warm voice of someone who cared. "Would you and your granddaughter join me in my chambers?" Then, turning to his clerk, he added, "Please call the cafe across the street. Tell them Judge Wilson needs a breakfast order delivered right away." The clerk nodded, already reaching for the phone. She knew which cafe he meant. The one that filled the courthouse with tantalizing smells every morning. The one that Rose had been smelling all morning, her empty stomach aching at the scent of fresh bread and warm food. Rose felt her grandmother's hand trembling in hers as they followed the judge. She'd never been inside a judge's chambers before. Few people had. It was like being invited into a mysterious world that most people only saw on TV. The judge's chambers were different from the formal courtroom. There were photographs on the walls, family pictures, graduation ceremonies, community events. Books lined the shelves, their spines well worn from use. A small coffee maker sat in the corner, and sunlight streamed through windows that looked out over the city. "Please, sit down," Judge Wilson said, gesturing to the comfortable chairs in front of his desk. As they sat, Rose noticed how her feet didn't quite touch the floor. Everything still felt big and important, but somehow less scary than before. A gentle knock at the door announced the arrival of breakfast. The judge's clerk entered, carrying bags that filled the room with wonderful smells. She set them down on the desk and quietly left, closing the door behind her. "First," the judge said, starting to unpack the bags, "we eat, then we talk." He pulled out warm breakfast sandwiches, fruit, orange juice, and milk. Rose's eyes went wide at the sight of so much food. Her grandmother started to protest, to say it was too much, but the judge held up his hand gently. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, "sometimes justice means more than following the law. Sometimes it means stopping to really see the person in front of you." He handed Rose a warm sandwich wrapped in paper. "And right now, what I see is a family doing their best in difficult circumstances." Rose took a small bite of the sandwich, then another, bigger one. The warm food seemed to bring color back to her cheeks. Her grandmother's eyes filled with tears as she watched her granddaughter eat, but these weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of relief, of being seen and understood. As they ate, Judge Wilson didn't ask questions about truancy or missed school days. Instead, he asked about their lives, about Mrs. Thompson's 2 jobs, about the long walk to school, about the bills that kept piling up. He listened without judgment, nodding occasionally, his face showing nothing but compassion and understanding. "Your Honor," Mrs. Thompson finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "I try so hard. I work every shift I can get, but after rent and utilities—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The judge understood. He reached for his phone, pressing a few buttons before speaking. "Cancel my next 2 appointments," he said to someone on the other end. Then he looked at Rose and her grandmother with determination in his eyes. "We're going to figure this out. Together." The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, warming the room. Outside, the usual sounds of the courthouse continued: footsteps, voices, the shuffle of papers, and the bang of gavels. But in here, in this moment, something different was happening. Something that went beyond law books and court procedures. A judge had stepped down from his bench to rise to a higher calling, that of basic human kindness. And in doing so, he was about to change not just one family's future, but the way his entire courthouse would handle cases involving children and families in need. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, the conversation in the judge's chambers took an unexpected turn. Rose had finished a breakfast and was now sipping milk through a straw, her eyes moving between her grandmother and the judge as they talked. The fear that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by something different: hope. "Tell me about your typical day," Judge Wilson said, his legal pad ready but his tone conversational. He'd loosened his tie slightly, and somehow that small change made him seem more approachable, more human. Mrs. Thompson's hands twisted in her lap as she spoke. "I wake up at 3:30 every morning," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I clean offices until 7:30, then rush home to get Rose ready for school." She paused, looking at her granddaughter with eyes full of love and worry. "The walk to school takes almost an hour each way." The judge's pen stopped moving. "An hour?" he asked, his forehead creasing with concern. "There's no school bus?" Rose spoke up then, her voice stronger now that her stomach was full. "We're outside the bus stone," she explained. "And sometimes when it rains or gets really cold." She trailed off, looking down at her worn shoes. Her grandmother picked up the thread. "She outgrew her winter coat last year. I've been trying to save for a new one, but with the heating bills so high," she stopped, fighting back tears. "I promised her mother I'd take care of her, but sometimes it feels like I'm failing." The judge set down his pen and leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson, raising a child alone while working 2 jobs isn't failing. It's heroic." He turned to his computer, typing quickly. "The school is 3 miles from your home." When Mrs. Thompson nodded, he continued typing, his fingers moving faster. "And your evening job? You mentioned it's at the hospital." "Yes, sir. I clean there too, from 7 p.m. to midnight. My neighbor watches Rose when she can, but sometimes," she looked down at her hands, "sometimes Rose has to stay alone. I know it's not right, but I don't have a choice." The judge's face showed no judgment, only understanding. He pressed a button on his desk phone. "Could you please ask Mrs. Chen from Social Services to join us?" He spoke into the intercom. Then he turned back to Rose. "While we wait, tell me about school. What's your favorite subject?" Rose's face lit up for the first time that morning. "I love reading," she exclaimed. "My teacher says I'm at a 5th grade level even though I'm only in 3rd grade. And I like math too," when she hesitated, then added quietly, "when I can concentrate." A knock at the door interrupted them, and a woman in a navy blue suit entered. Mrs. Chen had kind eyes and carried a tablet computer. The judge quickly brought her up to speed, speaking in low tones while Rose and her grandmother waited. Mrs. Chen sat down next to Mrs. Thompson and opened her tablet. "There are several programs that could help," she began, her voice warm and professional. "First, there's an immediate assistance program for winter clothing and school supplies. We can have that processed today." The judge nodded encouragingly as Mrs. Chen continued. "There's also a food assistance program you qualify for and a transportation service that helps families get children to school safely." She turned to her tablet, scrolling through more information. "And the hospital where you work, they have a childcare program for employees. Did anyone tell you about that?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened. "No, ma'am, I didn't know." Many people don't, Mrs. Chen said gently. That's part of the problem. Resources exist, but information doesn't always reach the people who need it most. The judge stood up and walked to his window, looking out over the city he'd served for so many years. This isn't just about one family, he said, almost to himself. Then he turned back to the room. Mrs. Thompson, Rose, your situation has opened my eyes to something important. How many other families are struggling like this? How many other children are missing school not because they don't want to learn, but because the barriers seem too high? He sat down again, his decision clear in his eyes. We're going to help you get everything set up with these programs today. But that's just the beginning. This court needs to change how we handle cases like yours. Rose watched as the adults began working together, making calls, filling out forms, and creating a plan. Her grandmother's shoulders gradually relaxed as each piece of help fell into place. The morning that had started with such fear was transforming into something entirely different. Mrs. Chen explained each program carefully, making sure Mrs. Thompson understood all the details. The judge occasionally added his own suggestions, thinking about practical solutions to each challenge they uncovered. It was like watching a puzzle being solved, piece by piece. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, and Rose's future looked considerably brighter. But more than that, something larger was taking shape in Judge Wilson's mind. A new way of approaching cases involving families in need, a system that would look beyond the surface to understand and address the real issues at play. The truth that had started with a child's hungry admission was growing into something that would touch countless lives in their community. And it all began because someone took the time to listen, to understand, and to care about the story behind the case number. Judge Wilson didn't return to his courtroom that afternoon. Instead, he sat in his office long after Rose and her grandmother had left, his mind racing with ideas and possibilities. His computer screen showed dozens of open tabs, local food banks, winter clothing drives, transportation services, and community support programs. But he knew that looking up information wasn't enough. Real change would require action. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Tom, it's Richard Wilson. Remember that conversation we had at last year's charity dinner? About wanting to make a difference in the community. I think it's time we did something about it. Tom owned the largest transportation company in the city. Within an hour, he was sitting in the judge's office, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, working on a plan. We've got 20 buses that sit idle between school runs, Tom explained, marking routes on a city map. We could easily pick up kids who live outside the normal school bus zones. The judge nodded, making notes. But transportation is just one piece of the puzzle, he said, reaching for another file. I've got 5 more cases this week alone, all children missing school. And I bet my gavel that many of them are facing similar challenges to Rose. As if on cue, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Chen from Social Services. Judge, you're not going to believe this, she said, her voice excited. I mentioned Rose's case to some colleagues. We've identified 30 other families in similar situations just in our current files. They all need help, but they're either afraid to ask or don't know where to start. The judge put the phone on speaker so Tom could hear. Together, they started brainstorming. By sunset, the judge's office whiteboard was covered with ideas, phone numbers, and action plans. Tom had committed his company's resources. Mrs. Chen had rallied her department. And the judge had scheduled meetings with school principals, community leaders, and local business owners. But he wasn't done yet. Walking to the courthouse cafeteria, he found the manager closing up for the day. How much would it cost, he asked, to provide breakfast for every child who comes through this courthouse? The manager did some quick calculations on a napkin. With bulk ordering and some help from local suppliers, she pushed the napkin across the counter, pointing to a number that was smaller than the judge expected. Could you start tomorrow? He asked. She smiled, already reaching for her phone to call her suppliers. For the kids, we'll make it happen. The next morning, Judge Wilson arrived earlier than usual. The cafeteria was already buzzing with activity, the smell of fresh bread and hot breakfast filling the air. He watched as a young boy with worn shoes clutched a warm muffin, his mother's eyes filling with tears of gratitude. But the judge knew food was just the beginning. He'd spent half the night setting up meetings and making calls. His first appointment of the day was with the owner of a local clothing store. "Winter's coming," the judge explained, showing him the statistics of children missing school due to lack of proper clothing. "We need to do something about this." The store owner didn't hesitate. "My warehouse is full of last season's coats. They're perfectly good, just not fashionable enough for our regular customers. Consider them donated." By lunchtime, the judge's secretary had cleared his afternoon schedule. He visited 3 schools, talking with principals and teachers, understanding their perspectives on student attendance. Every conversation revealed new challenges and new opportunities to help. At one school, a teacher pulled him aside. "It's not just food and transportation," she whispered. "Some of these kids are trying to do homework by candlelight because their electricity got cut off. Others are sharing one pencil between 3 siblings." The judge added these insights to his growing list. Each problem needed a solution, and he was determined to find them all. He reached out to the local utility company, negotiating payment plans and assistance programs for families in need. He contacted office supply stores about donating school materials. Back in his chambers, he started drafting a proposal, a new way for the court to handle cases involving children and families in need. Instead of simply enforcing attendance laws, they would first assess and address the underlying causes of truancy. His phone kept ringing as word spread about what he was doing. Local business owners offered support. Community organizations promised resources. Other judges from neighboring districts called, wanting to know more about his approach. By evening, what had started with one hungry child's honest words had grown into something much bigger. The judge sat at his desk, looking at the city lights twinkling outside his window. On his desk lay Rose's file, now joined by dozens of others, each representing a child who needed help, a family struggling to survive. He picked up a framed photo from his desk, a picture of himself as a child, standing proudly in front of his school. He remembered how different his life might have been if certain people hadn't stepped in to help his own family during tough times. Tomorrow, he would start implementing these changes officially. There would be paperwork to file, procedures to establish, systems to create. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that something important had begun, a ripple effect of compassion that would touch countless lives. The courthouse lights dimmed as night fell, but hope burned brighter than ever. One person's decision to look beyond the surface, to see the human story behind each case number, was about to change everything. And somewhere in the city, a little girl named Rose was doing her homework at a proper desk, with a full stomach and warm clothes, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of justice happen not with a bang of a gavel, but with a simple act of understanding. News travels fast in a small city, especially when it's good news. Within days, the story of what happened in Judge Wilson's courtroom had spread through the community like wildfire. It wasn't just the local newspaper that picked up the story. People were talking about it in coffee shops, at bus stops, and during their lunch breaks. The courthouse security guard was the first to share what he witnessed. "I've worked here for 20 years, he told the local reporter who'd come to verify the story. "Never seen anything like it." The judge just stepped down from his bench, right in the middle of proceedings. "Next thing I know, there's breakfast being delivered and people from all over the building coming together to help." The reporter, a veteran journalist who'd covered countless courthouse stories, knew she had something special. She spent hours interviewing people who'd been present that day. Each person added another layer to the story. The clerk who'd called in the breakfast order with tears in her eyes, the bailiff who'd helped carry in donations the next day, the social worker who'd stayed late organizing resources for families in need. But it was the cafeteria manager's story that really caught people's attention. The judge didn't just help one child, she explained, showing the reporter the new breakfast program in action. He made sure every child who comes through these doors has something to eat. And you know what? Local businesses started pitching in. The bakery down the street delivers fresh bread every morning. The grocery store sends fruit. People want to help. They just needed someone to show them how. The story ran on the front page of the Sunday paper. Local judge transforms courtroom into community support hub. The online version went viral, shared thousands of times across social media platforms. People from other cities started calling, wanting to know how they could implement similar programs in their communities. Inside the courthouse, the changes were even more dramatic. The once intimidating building had transformed into a place of hope. The main entrance now featured a resource center where families could learn about available assistance programs. Volunteer lawyers offered free consultations during lunch hours. Social workers maintained regular office hours, helping people navigate the system. But perhaps the most significant change was in how cases were handled. Judge Wilson's new approach had inspired his colleagues. Other judges began looking beyond the surface of their cases, asking questions about the underlying causes of problems rather than simply passing judgment. One morning, a young teacher arrived at the courthouse with her entire class. They'd raised money through a bake sale and wanted to donate it to the breakfast program. The judge invited them into his courtroom, not to witness a trial, but to learn about how communities can work together to solve problems. "You see," he told the wide-eyed students, "a courtroom isn't just about rules and punishments. It's about understanding and helping people. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is listen." The local business community had caught the spirit too. The owner of a tech company donated refurbished laptops for students who needed them for schoolwork. A dental office offered free checkups. A local theater group started performing educational plays about justice and community in the courthouse lobby during lunch breaks. Even the physical appearance of the courthouse began to change. The stark walls now displayed artwork from local schools, brightening the formerly intimidating space. The waiting areas featured books for children and information about community resources. Plants donated by a local nursery added life to the corners. One day, a grandmother who'd been helped by the new programs brought in a handmade quilt. "It's not much," she said shyly, "but I wanted to give something back." The quilt now hangs in the courthouse entrance, its patches representing different stories of hope and healing. The impact reached far beyond the courthouse walls. School attendance rates began to climb as barriers were removed one by one. Teachers reported students arriving more focused and ready to learn. Parents found the courage to seek help before small problems became big ones. Local colleges took notice too. Law students started volunteering at the resource center, gaining practical experience while helping families in need. Social work students conducted research on the program's effectiveness, documenting its success for other communities to study. The media attention brought unexpected benefits. Other courthouses across the state began implementing similar programs. Conferences invited Judge Wilson to speak about his innovative approach. But he always deflected the praise, reminding people that it all started with one child's honest words. One afternoon, a group of civic leaders gathered in the courthouse lobby to unveil a new plaque. It didn't bear anyone's name or title. Instead, it simply read, "Justice grows where compassion blooms." Below these words was a small drawing of a breakfast table, symbolizing how something as simple as sharing a meal could start a revolution of kindness. The courthouse had become more than a place where laws were enforced. It was now a center of community healing and support. People no longer arrived with just their problems. They came with solutions to share, help to offer, and hope to find. And somewhere in the city, a little girl who'd once been too hungry to focus in school was now thriving, her story having sparked a movement that would continue to grow and touch countless lives, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with the smallest moments of truth and compassion. 3 months had passed since that morning when a hungry child's words changed everything. The autumn leaves were turning golden outside the courthouse windows as Rose and her grandmother walked through the familiar doors once again. But this time, everything felt different. The security guard greeted them with a warm smile, offering Rose one of the fresh apples that now sat in a bowl by the metal detectors. "Big day today," he said, giving her a friendly wink. Rose nodded, clutching her school folder tightly to her chest. Inside were her latest report cards and attendance records, evidence of how much could change in just 3 months. The courthouse lobby buzzed with activity. A group of volunteers was setting up the morning's resource fair, arranging tables with information about everything from job training to after-school programs. The breakfast program was in full swing, filling the air with warm, inviting smells. Children and parents sat at small tables, sharing meals and conversation before their court appointments. Mrs. Thompson paused to help a young mother figure out the new resource center's touchscreen directory. She'd become a regular volunteer, coming in on her days off to help other families navigate the system that had helped her family so much. Her own experience made her the perfect guide for others facing similar challenges. As they made their way to Judge Wilson's courtroom, Rose noticed the new artwork on the walls, photographs showing the community coming together, helping each other, making things better. She spotted herself in one of them, helping to sort donated school supplies last month. The caption read, "Change starts with caring." The courtroom itself had been transformed. Gone was the intimidating atmosphere that had once made Rose's knees shake. Now, child-height tables and chairs sat near the front, stocked with coloring books and quiet activities for young visitors. The harsh fluorescent lights had been replaced with softer, more natural lighting. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Wilson entered. He still wore his black robe, but his face broke into a warm smile as he saw Rose and her grandmother. This wasn't just another follow-up hearing. This was a celebration of what could happen when people chose to look beyond the surface and really help each other. "Rose Thompson," the judge called, his voice carrying the same warmth that had shone that first morning. "Would you like to tell us how you've been doing?" Rose stood confidently, no longer the hungry, frightened child who had stood in this spot 3 months ago. "I haven't missed a single day of school," she announced proudly. "The bus picks me up every morning, and I have breakfast at school. My teachers say my grades are the highest in the class for math and reading." Her grandmother added, "And she's teaching other kids in the after-school program. The teachers say she has a gift for helping students who are struggling." The judge nodded, clearly moved. "And how are things at home?" Mrs. Thompson straightened in her chair. "The assistance programs helped us get caught up on our bills. I still work 2 jobs, but now Rose goes to the hospital's after-school care program where I work. She does her homework there, and they even serve dinner. The winter clothing program gave her a new coat, and," she paused, emotions catching in her throat, "we haven't had to skip any meals since that day." The judge looked around his courtroom, now filled with social workers, volunteers, and community members who had come to witness this moment. Rose's case wasn't just about truancy, he said. It was about how we, as a community, respond when one of our children tells us they're hungry. It was about looking beyond the surface to see the real problems and working together to solve them. He turned back to Rose. "Your courage in speaking the truth that day didn't just change your life. It helped us create the Community Support Initiative, which has now helped over 300 families. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit when we need help." The judge stood, stepping down from his bench as he had done that first morning. But this time he carried something in his hands, a framed certificate. "Rose," he said, "this is the first Spirit of Change Award. We'll give it each month to someone who helps make our community stronger. And you, young lady, are our first recipient." Rose's eyes widened as she accepted the frame. Inside was a picture of the courthouse, surrounded by words that told her story, not the story of a hungry child in trouble, but the story of how one honest moment could spark a movement of positive change. The small audience applauded, but they weren't just celebrating Rose. They were celebrating everything that had changed in 3 months, the hundreds of children now getting regular meals, the families receiving support, the community coming together to help its most vulnerable members. As Rose and her grandmother left the courthouse that day, they'd passed a new family coming in, looking scared and uncertain just as they had 3 months ago. Mrs. Thompson smiled at them, gesturing toward the resource center. "Don't worry," she said gently. "You've come to the right place. Here, let me show you where to start." And up in his chambers, Judge Wilson watched through his window as more people arrived, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, their own hopes. The simple truth spoken by a hungry child had started something that would continue to grow and change lives for years to come. Because sometimes justice isn't just about laws and punishments. Sometimes it's about listening, understanding, and working together to create lasting change. And sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices speaking the simplest truths.